Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and all my other spooky friends. I hope you're enjoying this beautiful Halloween season because I fucking love Halloween. I love the atmosphere, the aesthetics, and I love horror media. If this were not apparent by my videos on Silent Hill 3 and Perfect Blue, horror is probably my favorite genre in any medium. Whether it be classic novels like Frankenstein, movies like Friday the 13th, or games like Resident Evil, the mood and tone that horror can evoke is unmatched by any other genre. Not only that, but like I've said in previous videos, horror has the ability to delve into some uncomfortable yet compelling topics that are almost impossible for any other genre to approach. Which is odd when you consider that horror is seen as a lowbrow and childish genre. It's not prestigious like drama, and yet it can tell some of the most mature stories in fiction. Which reminds me, I have a very special story picked out for all of you tonight. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess. Beautiful, yet oh so lonely. She had been alone as long as she could remember. Loneliness was her friend, and loneliness was always accompanied by their friend, guilt. In all of her days, she was always together with loneliness and guilt. But then, the lonely princess discovered a beautiful garden of roses. She frolicked amongst the roses and fell madly in love with this world. She soon came across the residents of the rose garden, and they were none too happy that a princess from a far-off land had come into their home. And so, they turned this princess into a mere commoner, and now, the princess was lonely and less than human. She no longer abode by the customs of her homeland, but instead, she now must live by one simple rule. All promises made to the ones you love must be kept. This was the law of aristocrats. This was the rule of Rose. Rule of Rose is one of the most famous horror games of the 6th generation, but it remains criminally underplayed. Its fame is mostly due to, holy mother of God, look at that price tag, oh fuck! Yeah, gonna be honest, as a collector and horror game aficionado, Rule of Rose is not worth the asking price. I genuinely enjoy this game, but I'm a fucking psycho who can have fun kicking a boulder if it reads me War and Peace while I break my tibia. So, since this is a relatively obscure title, I'll give a basic setup and later on we'll dive further into the narrative. Rule of Rose tells the story of Jennifer, who is kidnapped and taken aboard an airship and repeatedly goofed on by a gaggle of disgusting cockney nightmares known as the Aristocrat Club, as they shout abuse at her, saying hurtful things like, "Oi, show her she means love," and
"You think you're sick though, man? You will know about it when I fucking Batista bomb your nan in the middle of Asda and shove an eggplant up her fanny, the fucking dustbag."
It's not all bad though. She meets a dog named Brown along the way, and from there, her adventures into survival horror truly begin. Despite being a Japanese game, Rule of Rose is incredibly British. For some reason or another, I am fatally attracted to turn-of-the-century England as a setting, which is strange because if you didn't catch it in the summary, I harbor a deep, burning hatred for Brits. If you happen to be a British viewer, then I'm sorry, but some crimes just can't be forgiven. Regardless of my bias, the setting of the most fucked up orphanarium transitioning into a monolithic airship is such a wild yet welcome jump. The way the game looks is just so filthy, it makes you really feel like you're in England. I have nothing clever to follow that one up, I just won Northern Ireland back. Jumping to it, children scare me, and British children make me want to do a backflip out the goddamn window. Rule of Rose may be the greatest advertisement for contraception and Anglican genocide on the emulator market today. This game is basically a cross between a cyberbullying simulator and Oliver Twist. Oh no, not that one! Kids have been a staple in horror media for a long time since children have a strange energy about them that makes people wary. So you have films like The Omen and Devil Times 5 reinforcing this unease that we feel towards spooky kindergartners. I think it's the fact that children are much smarter than we actually give them credit for, and also they have absolutely no control over their emotions. Rule of Rose takes this evocative fear, combined with the fact that all of the Red Crown aristocrats are openly hostile and act like little scumbags towards Jennifer, which together does a great job of creating a feeling of pure isolation. Loneliness is a tentpole of survival horror. If a game can make you feel like you're all on your own, then you will begin to believe it and you will get spooked. Now, there are two types of loneliness a game can make you feel. There is the Resident Evil approach of stranding the player in an impossible situation and forcing them to solve it on their own, or the Silent Hill approach of making the environment itself an unfriendly entity and the enemies therein are actually inconsequential. Rule of Rose takes a bold stance and attempts to combine the two by giving the player an impossible hierarchy to overcome in an environment they have no chance of escaping like the former, but takes the tonal sensibilities and atmosphere building of the latter. To best explain it, there is no mystery as to why Leon is stuck in the RPD, but there is a mystery surrounding what exactly James's relation to Silent Hill is. I've heard some people call Rule of Rose the unofficial Silent Hill 5, and while I can somewhat see what they're getting at, I don't think it's all there. The difference comes in the form of game design instead of narrative, but I'll get there when I get there. I do want to heap as much praise as I possibly can on how much I love the airship as a setting for a horror game. Much like my inexplicable love for Victorian settings, I too also adore ships as a backdrop to any game. Titles like Echo Knight and 999 use a naval ship to its best effect, but the only game I've seen really go hard on airships is like Skies of Arcadia. So needless to say, Rule of Rose is in a league of its own in the interesting environment department. The creaks and clunks of this vessel create this ambiance that feels so much bigger than the player. The game uses its limited sound design to its fullest effect by making the player feel small, and it gives them this underlying dread that something foul could be lurking around the next corner. This is the proper way to use a game's environment to its fullest effect. The only game I've seen do something similar besides that one series I'd never shut the fuck up about is Fatal Frame 2. There is a reward to discovery, but there is a chance you could encounter an enemy, and if you're at that point, you're really up the creek without a paddle. It gives the player the opportunity to sink their teeth into learning the ins and outs of their surroundings, but it also allows the game to play back and effectively keep the player on their toes. While this is all well and good and the moody strings fill out the rest of the soundscape, this push to exploration is actually kind of cut off when we look into more how the game handles its mechanics. Survival horror games are not known for their high skill ceiling playstyles or even for fun gameplay, but some do eke out better than others. Textbook examples nowadays are the RE2 and RE3 makes, which give a modern control feel to classic survival horror design philosophy. Even judging it amongst its peers, Silent Hill 3 released 3 years prior and has an overall better feel because the player is put in a position of relative powerlessness, while the game is wholly designed around what the player can and cannot do, and thus play feels fair, with the focus less on the player's ability to fight their way out of a situation and more so focused on exploration and puzzle solving. As you might glean from that statement, a huge crack in the design of Rule of Rose is its spamming of enemies. I had previously said that Rule of Rose attempts to marry the designs of RE and Silent Hill, and I was not kidding when I said that. As often compared as they are, the game designs of Silent Hill and Resident Evil could not be more polar opposites. Resident Evil has always been a more action-focused affair, and the tension came by giving the player an obstacle normally in the form of a zombie, and more often than not having them think their way out of said scenario by using as little of their limited stock as they can, while reducing how much damage they would incur. Meanwhile, Silent Hill is focused on letting the player explore and solve its various flavors of key puzzles, and the tension is found not in enemy encounters, but instead in the mood and tone the game sets for itself. You can go through most Silent Hill games without killing a single enemy, and running low on munitions is rarely a problem. Personally, the only time I have ever felt a Silent Hill game approach Resident Evil levels of design is in the last section of 3. So where does that exactly leave Rule of Rose? You know, the game we came here for? Well, Rule of Rose wants the player to solve key hunting puzzles and explore their surroundings like Silent Hill, but the game also wants the player to have to outthink enemies and buy their resources, and have to think their way out of tight spots. In wanting the best of both worlds, the game decides the only way it can make this work is by, oddly enough, copying character action enemy placement. I'm just gonna let that one sit for a second. Someone at Punchline went, "God damn it, Jim, the testers aren't scared enough of these enemies. How are we gonna handle this?" And poor sad Jim said, "Well, sir, maybe we should design the enemies to be slightly stronger than the player while placing them in positions that require adequate input from said player to escape them and continue on to their objective." And the big boss man said, "Yeah, no, fuck that, Jim. Let's just take the same stupid grunt enemy and spawn it like fucking 40 times this hallway. That'll scare him," as he began to choke poor Jim with a bucket of peanuts he keeps around for the asphyxiation of insubordinate staff members. I told you this is a Halloween video. I'm not joking when I say there are some parts of this game that remind me of Bayonetta missions, since you encounter areas where someone locks you in a room and the only way to get out is by killing all the imps that drop out of nowhere, like someone turned on Legendary Dark Knight mode. This is incredibly frustrating towards one of the final chapters, where you're tasked with killing 3 different enemy types twice to open the door to end the level. Not only do you fight them in rooms crawling with miscellaneous foes, but the amount of healing items you have on you frankly does not cut it. And yes, I know you're supposed to feel limited in a survival horror game, it's right there in the title, but there needs to be some give and take with these kinds of things. Silent Hill is very generous with health items, and if you're smart, you can make these last the whole game. This is because Silent Hill controls like shit, but it never makes combat a big focus, so the jank controls add to the overall experience instead of becoming a hindrance. Just to review so we're all on the same page, Rule of Rose gives you the item restrictions of Resident Evil, the jank-ass controls of Silent Hill, and the enemy placement of Devil May Cry. You can see how this gets very frustrating very fast. But you know what? If that's how they want to play, then that's how they want to play. Just because Jennifer moves like she's covered in cement and takes hits like her bones are only hypothetical, that's not gonna stop me from going Ripper mode on this boss fight. Yeah, I got your fucking fish and chips right here, motherfucker! The only other interesting piece of gameplay is the super duper original dog companion Brown. What do you mean it's not original? Nobody played Haunting Ground! In terms of game design, Brown is actually a pretty neat tool, as Jennifer can use him to find certain objects based on the smell of other objects. This can lead to the discovery of various health items and other goodies. There is definitely room for critique due to the fact that every puzzle more or less is designed around giving Brown an item to find and following him till he finds it. Is this repetitive and somewhat obnoxious? Yes. Is it story relevant? Yes. Am I gonna bullshit an explanation as to why I actually really like this design choice? Oh, you bet. But to talk about Brown, I have to discuss Rule of Rose's narrative. Like most things I enjoy, we are here for the story, and Rule of Rose is no different. Jennifer's tale is hidden throughout the game, and discerning the truth from the metaphor is half of the fun of the experience, so if you're vaguely interested in playing this, I advise you dip out now and download this, purchase this ROM at your favorite totally legal Emmy Paradise distributor. For those of you willing to stick with me through this tale of tragedy, allow me to expand on the story from before, but with some clarity this time. Jennifer was a young girl who was caught up in a Zeppelin crash that took the lives of both of her parents. Not long after, she was kidnapped by a man named Gregory who had previously lost his son Joshua. He dressed Jennifer as his lost son and quartered her in his basement. Soon a child came by named Wendy, and she made quick friends with Jennifer, who she thought was a boy. The two fell in love, and Wendy aided in Jennifer's escape. She took Jennifer to the orphanage she was staying at, and the two's friendship kept growing into something more. Then, one day, Jennifer found another friend, a small puppy named Brown. Now, Jennifer had made plenty of promises, but there are two that are of the utmost importance. To Brown, she promised that she'd protect him until the day she died, and to Wendy, she promised everlasting true love, I'm yours. Sadly, both of these promises were impossible to keep. Jennifer never had a chance to fulfill either, since forever is a variable that cannot be guaranteed. As time went on, Jennifer drifted away from Wendy and towards caring for Brown, which angered Wendy. So she gathered up the other children of the orphanage and created the Red Crayon Aristocrats, and in doing so, created the Aristocrat Club. The aim of this club was to make Jennifer miserable enough that she would realize how much she needs Wendy. Instead, this pushed Jennifer more and more into a corner, and the only comfort she found was in her friend Brown. After attempts to spread rumors that Brown was a menace who would eventually kill all the other children failed to drive Jennifer back into her arms, Wendy took drastic measures and destroyed the only thing Jennifer cared for. This made the quiet Jennifer snap and strike her old friend, and in response, Wendy wanted revenge. So she did the only thing she thought she could do, and convinced Gregory to follow her to the orphanage by dressing as Joshua. This was only meant to scare the children, but that wasn't what happened. In a psychotic episode, Gregory killed all of the orphanage's residents except for Jennifer, and then he killed himself. This once more left the lonely princess all alone. So, what's the deal with the airship and all these gross-ass critters crawling around? Well, not to be that guy, but it's trauma. The game is about Jennifer processing trauma. I've noticed a lot of games I've played recently have dealt with that theme. There's nothing deeper to that.
I hope.
But seriously, I think video games have a really interesting way of portraying things like trauma and stress. Like I said last time, Flower, Sun, and Rain more or less feels like playing my anxiety, and that's a powerful experience no other medium can truly replicate. Since the player is such a necessary agent for the narrative to play out, whatever emotion the story is meant to leave the audience with is amplified since we feel a direct connection to it. Besides being a curio item, I think this is what keeps Rule of Rose as such a talked about game even to this day. Despite its relative obscurity, it survived almost solely off the strength of its themes and just by how much of an emotional gut punch the story is. This is also half due to how the story is delivered through its environment. Along with being a unique setting, the airship is a fresh metaphor for being completely trapped. Jennifer has two options aboard this cursed voyage. She can either A, play along with the sadistic aristocrat game and be a victim, or jump and risk falling back into the grasps of Gregory. Not only does the game make good use of its setting to impart its themes, but like I had mentioned, its core game mechanics end up putting the player in almost the same position as Jennifer. The usage of Brown as not only the primary tool for exploration, but also as the solution to most puzzles, causes the player to become dependent on him. Without Brown, the player has no ability to progress, so you begin to fall back on using his find mechanic more and more, much like how Jennifer fell further into his comfort the more she was pushed away by Wendy. This also gives more justification for Wendy to take umbrage with Jennifer, and by extension, the player. I can heap praise on this game's narrative all day, but I feel as though that would be mildly misleading since I actually do have issues with it. Honestly, 90% of this game's story comes down to audience extrapolation upon vague hints thrown to you if you're really looking hard for them. This kind of storytelling is something that would become way more widespread with 7th generation horror titles like Amnesia: The Dark Descent and BioShock. I would actually like to focus on that latter example since BioShock allows the player to not only piece together the story of Rapture and its people through audio logs, but it also gives the player sequences where they experience a ghost of the past engage in some important event from their life. On the first playthrough, not many people would exactly know what these moments mean, but with the context of the rest of the narrative on a repeat playthrough, the player is given enough information to put the pieces together and create their own story about what happened here. I give that context so that what I say next makes a lot more sense. Rule of Rose is a stellar story that is brought down to the level of being good based solely off the delivery of the narrative. I heard something like this from an owl I met in a dream once. I think he said, "A story is like a joke. A good joke poorly delivered is a bad joke, but a mediocre joke with flawless delivery can be elevated to a great joke." I'd be lying if I said I had a clear grasp on Rule of Rose's story by the end of my playthrough. Could this be the result of me not exploring that often? Most definitely. But this is where that really clever thing I praised earlier becomes both super clever and super fucking annoying. Since Brown is the key to open all doors, it disincentivizes players from exploring off the beaten path since why would I not follow the progress dog? This could be taken one of two ways. It could be seen as a design flaw that shrouds the story, the main reason we're here, in layers of obscurity which can be alienating to a general audience, or it could be taken as an extension of the over-reliance on Brown as an emotional crutch for Jennifer. By following Brown without breaking eye contact, Jennifer is ignoring all of her baggage and keeps things hidden from the audience due to the guilt and shame that she's packed in there. She's leaning so hard on Brown in the emotional and literal sense that he is bound to break. This makes his death that much more of a gut punch for the audience. I mean, it was going to be a gut punch anyway, since dogs dying in anything is automatically sympathetic and can be seen as a cheap way to foster empathy, but I think the lads earned this one. Rule of Rose is a fascinating title. I actually played this game about 5 or so years ago and absolutely hated it. I despise how it played, I loathed the monotony, and I just could not bring myself to see it through to the end. Now I'm a fucking crack smoker who thinks a DS game where you do math is one of the most moving narratives in the medium, so I can safely say I enjoyed my time aboard the Rose Garden's wild ride. Would I recommend it to those not already fans of this specific kind of survival horror game? Not really. I feel like even though I hold a profound love for these kinds of games, the gameplay was getting to be a bit too much even for me. But if you have the hanker in this Halloween season and beyond to pick up a thought-provoking and emotionally powerful game, it'd be hard for me not to recommend Rule of Rose. But before I leave you tonight, I'd like to go back and finish our story from before, just to give you something to fall asleep to. After some time amongst the roses, the lonely princess knew she had been here before. She knew what happened here. She knew the promises that had been shattered and the love that had been lost. It pained her to remember, but she knew above all else she had to embrace her loneliness and overcome it. Her promises laid broken like twigs on a path. The law of aristocrats was meaningless now, and all that was left was her hatred. It warped her brain and rotted her heart. She felt as though she was not human anymore. That is, until she examined her situation one final time. All the pain and sorrow she pushed into her own mind only served to make it worse than it was. Our princess was no villain, but a victim. She had not deserved her suffering. Yes, she had done wrong, but that was an age of ignorance. There was no way she would have known better. So, amongst the land of broken hearts and crushed oaths, the lonely princess decided to make one final promise. I promise I will love you. She said this to an empty room, one devoid of all life except for her own. These simple words were a binding contract with herself, a meeting of mind and heart. She had not only promised undying love one final time, she also gave herself a gift. Not a toy or a flower, but a chance. By forgiving herself and learning to love once more, she had given herself the chance to live happily ever after. My name is Michael. Let's talk again soon.